It's a great privilege to rise tonight and participate in this adjournment debate. Now, tonight I want to follow up on a question that I first asked on February 12th in question period. And at the time I asked the question to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, who, as you know, Mr. Speaker, is also the member from Papineau. Now, unfortunately, at the time, he did not respond, and rather the response came from the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. The question was on interprovincial trade and the challenges at that time that were being experienced between our friends in Alberta and British Columbia. Now, of course, Mr. Speaker, you'll recall at the time that due to the British Columbia government's efforts to block the TMX Trans Mountain expansion, Alberta was threatening to ban the import of BC wine into Alberta. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you know, the industry within Canada is greatly affected by trade barriers between our province. And it falls on this government to finally take a stand to end trade barriers between our provinces. The challenges that are faced by provinces because of trade barriers account to up to $130 billion in lost economic activity because of trade barriers. And this all stems from an interpretation of the Constitution, Section 121, which states, all articles of the growth, produce, or manufacture of any one of the provinces shall, from and after the Union, be admitted free into each of the other provinces. Now, unfortunately, over the years, this interpretation of that section has been deemed to mean only tariffs. But the reality is non-tariff barriers between our provinces are having a significant impact on our economy. And in fact, the Liberal government's efforts to sign the Canadian Free Trade Agreement were a failure. Indeed, if we look at the CFTA, we find that the agreement itself is 353 pages long, yet 146 of those pages are exceptions. They are exceptions that permit trade barriers to remain in place. They range on issues from mining to livestock medicine to timber processing to wine and beer. And as I travel through my constituency and through constituency across this country, I get the opportunity to meet with small business owners. They may be distilleries, they may be craft breweries, but they're small businesses who are trying their best to develop a product, to develop a business, and to market it across the province and across the country. And talking to some of these business owners, they tell me that it's easier for them to import into the United States than into a neighboring province. Mr. Speaker, this is wrong. And in fact, Andrew Coyne of the National Post wrote about the Liberals' failed efforts on interprovincial trade. He wrote, quote, "For all the attempts to paint the new Canadian Free Trade Agreement as a heroic achievement, there was no disguising the fact that what the ministers were here to announce was a failure." And so on February 12th, as Shadow Secretary for Interprovincial Trade, I asked the government about their failed and poor record on interprovincial trade. And in response, the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development said, quote, "We strongly advocate and support free trade among the provinces and territories." And then he pointed to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement as an example of this. But as I've outlined, Mr. Speaker, most of that was exceptions to the rule. And so poor was the Canadian Free Trade Agreement on many of the issues that only two provinces have actually introduced legislation to ratify the CFTA. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the government and the parliamentary secretary, why will they not stand up for small businesses and tear down the trade barriers that are blocking our economic productivity? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary for the Minister of National Revenue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to respond to comments made earlier by the honourable member from Perth Wellington regarding interprovincial trade. Mr. Speaker, our government has shown tremendous leadership in advancing internal trade throughout Canada. On April 7, 2017, Mr. Speaker, our government and all of the provinces and territories announced the successful completion of the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Mr. Speaker, our government is proud to have played a leadership role in the agreement's negotiations. And we worked in collaboration with provinces and territories in order to craft a new agreement, an ambitious and modern framework for more open trade within Canada. It is the most comprehensive reform to Canada's internal market in over 20 years. Mr. Speaker, since entering into force on July 1st, 2017, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement has delivered. It includes a comprehensive new process to align regulations, remove barriers, and help reduce business costs. It provides broader access for Canadian companies to billions of dollars in government's procurement contracts across the country. In fact, Mr. Speaker, for the first time, Canadian companies operating in certain regulatory professions, such as engineering, are now able to compete for government contracts across the country. In addition, Mr. Speaker, suppliers to most publicly owned energy utilities can now also bid for a range of government contracts in many parts of the country. The agreement's rules provide a framework that opens up trade within our borders in virtually every sector of the economy. It helps ensure that businesses based in Canada have the same or better access to our market as our international trading partners. More open markets are helping Canadian businesses scale up at home so that they can compete globally. Mr. Speaker, this agreement maintains strong provisions to ensure that Canadians can work in different jurisdictions across the country. It also ensures transparency and accountability for regulatory notification and for public reporting. And the Canadian Free Trade Agreement has increased maximum monetary penalties to better ensure that governments comply with the agreement's rules. Finally, the agreement is forward-looking. It sets out a process and timetable towards enhanced trade in a few sectors of the economy that are not currently covered. That includes the scale of alcoholic beverages. To that end, Mr. Speaker, our government worked with provinces and territories to secure a commitment to establish a working group on the interprovincial trade in alcohol. This working group is mandated to propose actions within 1 year to further liberalize domestic trade in alcohol in a socially responsible manner, and its work is well underway. Our government is committed to working hard to stand up for freer trade in our country. We want to enhance the flow of goods, services, investments, and workers across the country without any impediments. And we want to continue working with all parties towards a rapid and cooperative resolutions for any issues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Parliamentary Secretary says the CFTA has delivered. But the fact of the matter is that's simply not true. There are still 146 pages of exceptions out of 353, and it's still illegal in most provinces to transport beer and wine for personal use. Now, the Parliamentary Secretary talks about the working groups that have been established. Yet when I asked an order paper question how those working groups were progressing, what I got back was zero information. In fact, they said that they could not even provide the list of attendees of the working group meetings or the agenda items or the decisions and agreements made because it would be injurious to federal-provincial relations. How poorly are these working group meetings going that they can't even disclose the attendees of the meetings without it being injurious to federal-provincial relations? Mr. Speaker, I ask again, why will the government simply not stand up for the right of individuals to transport beer and wine across provincial boundaries without impediments? It's good for the economy.
The Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, there can be no doubt about our government's commitment to strengthening trade within Canada. We have made the biggest strides in a generation to modernize Canada's internal trade framework. In the face of continued global uncertainty, we have taken a leadership role in working together with provinces and territories to enhance our domestic market. Mr. Speaker, we remain committed to a freer trade within Canada because we know that's good for the middle class and that's good for our economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.